Marcus Aurelius, full documentary. Chapter 1. The tent on the frozen Danube. Snow falls on a dead man's fire. It is the year 172, and somewhere along the black ribbon of the Danube River, at the ragged northern edge of the Roman Empire, a military camp lies half buried in frost. The tents sit in perfect grid formation, a small rectangle of order stamped into a wilderness that recognizes no such thing. Smoke rises from a dozen different fires, and not all of them are for warmth. Some are funeral pyres burning around the clock because the men have stopped keeping pace with the dying. Picture it. Picture the cold so total it turns breath into small ghosts that hang in the air before a man's face and vanish. Picture the mud beneath the snow, frozen into ridges hard as pottery, cut by the wheels of supply carts, and the boots of legionaries who no longer walk with the swagger of conquerors. Picture the river itself, wide and slate-grey, and beyond it, the dark tree line where fires flicker at irregular intervals. Those are not Roman fires. Those belong to the Marcomanni and the Quadi and the Iazyges, tribal confederations who have spent generations studying the empire that now studies them back with such evident anxiety. Listen, beneath the wind, beneath the groan of ice on the river, there is a sound that does not belong to nature, a drumbeat. Slow, deliberate, carrying across the water with the particular clarity that cold air gives to sound. It is not random noise. It is a message, and every centurion in that camp understands its meaning perfectly. The tribes are not sleeping tonight. Somewhere across that river, warriors are checking spear points and murmuring to gods that Rome does not worship, and they are waiting for the weakest hour before dawn. Now turn from the drums and the frozen water and the columns of ash rising into a moonless sky, and look toward the one tent in this camp that appears, at first glance, to deserve no special attention at all. It is not the largest structure in the camp. It is not draped in silk or ringed with unusual numbers of guards. It is canvas and rope and cold iron stakes hammered into frozen earth, like every other command tent that has ever sheltered a Roman officer on campaign. Inside, a single oil lamp burns, its flames small and amber, throwing long shadows against the tent walls whenever the wind finds a gap in the fabric and makes the flame shiver. By that lamp, a man sits bent over a low field table. He is not young. His beard, cropped close in the fashion of the age, is streaked with more grey than his years should allow, and there is a heaviness in how he holds his shoulders, the specific exhaustion of a body that has been sick and has not yet finished being sick. His eyes are tired in the way that suggests he has not slept properly in longer than he could easily calculate, and yet his hand is steady. In it he holds a stylus, and beneath the stylus is a tablet of wax, and on that wax, in careful Greek letters, he is writing. This is Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, Emperor of Rome, commander of some 44 legions, ruler of a domain that stretches, at this very moment, from the fog-bound hills of Roman Britain to the burning edges of the Sahara, from the Atlantic coast of Hispania to the Persian frontier beyond the Euphrates. There is no human being alive who commands more territory, more wealth, more armed men, more absolute and unquestioned authority than the man sitting in this tent. And what is he doing with that authority tonight? He is not drafting an edict. He is not composing a triumphant dispatch to the Senate. He is writing to himself. A private note, unsigned, meant for no eyes but his own, on a subject that has nothing to do with empire at all. At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, he writes, tell yourself, I have to go to work as a human being. Consider the strangeness of this scene for a moment, because it deserves to be considered strange. Here is a man who could, tonight, be reclining on a couch in a marble palace in Rome, 1,000 miles south of this frozen river, wrapped in furs, attended by slaves, watching gladiators bleed for his entertainment in the Flavian amphitheater. Nothing prevents this. Every luxury the ancient world can produce sits waiting for him in the capital, ready at a word. Instead, he is here, in the mud and the frost, at the ragged edge of the map, because he has chosen, for a decade now, to lead these frontier campaigns in person rather than delegate them to generals and watch the outcome from a comfortable distance. The tribes across the river are not the disorganized rabble that Roman propaganda likes to imagine. They are sophisticated warrior societies with generations of accumulated knowledge about how Roman legions fight, where they are strong, and precisely where they are weakening now. They know the emperor has been ill. They know his co-ruler and adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, is already dead. They know his son, Commodus, is a boy more interested in circus games than governance, waiting back in Rome to inherit all of this. They smell weakness on this frontier the way wolves smell blood in snow. And they are not wrong to smell it, because behind Marcus, in the camp beyond his tent, the fires burning are not only for warmth. The empire he commands is dying, quietly, from something no sword can touch. It is a plague, one that has already killed an almost unthinkable number across the Roman world, an estimated 5 million subjects by some reckonings, sweeping through cities and camps, alike with a cruelty that makes barbarian spears look almost merciful by comparison. His own personal physician, the great Galen of Pergamon, fled the city of Rome rather than remain and face it directly. The disease, likely a form of smallpox, follows a horrifying and consistent pattern. First the fever, so severe that soldiers tear the armor from their own bodies in temperatures that would otherwise kill them from cold alone. Then the pustules, spreading across the skin like scales on some ruined and unrecognizable creature. Then, for those who do not die of the fever itself, a slow drowning as the throat and lungs fill and betray them. The stench of it hangs over parts of this camp even now, mixing with wood smoke and the copper smell of old blood. Marcus has watched this happen. Not once, not as a report delivered by a subordinate, but directly with his own eyes, holding the hands of soldiers not yet 20 years old as they died of a disease against which courage and duty and Roman discipline count for absolutely nothing. He knows, with the plain, unsentimental clarity that seems to define everything about him, that he will very likely die of the same illness himself, perhaps soon, perhaps here, perhaps in this very tent. And so we return to the question this scene forces upon us, the question this entire history circles back to again and again. What does a man do when he holds more power than almost any human being in recorded history, and knows he is dying, and knows his empire may be dying with him? He does not rage. He does not indulge. He does not retreat into the desperate pleasures that so many emperors before him chased in their final years, the wine, the executions, the spectacle. Instead, by the light of one small lamp, while war drums sound across a frozen river and plague fires burn behind him, he writes sentences like this one, later found among his private papers. Remember that very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking. These words were never meant for us. They were never meant for publication, for glory, for the judgment of history. They carry no title, no dedication, no audience beyond the man holding the stylus. He writes them in Greek rather than Latin, because Greek is the language of philosophy in his world, not the language of imperial power, and this, whatever else it is not an act of power. It is something else, something private, unguarded, almost confessional. What was written on the tablets stacked near that lamp, night after night, across these frozen years, we will come to know in time more fully than perhaps we expect. But to understand why those words exist at all, why an emperor of Rome spent his final campaigns not conquering territory, but interrogating his own soul in a language of quiet discipline, we cannot start here, in the mud and ash of the Danube frontier. We have to go back, decades back, back across the length of an empire, away from war drums and plague pyres, to a very different scene entirely. A sunlit courtyard on the Caelian Hill in Rome, where a small boy, born into wealth and privilege he never asked for, is doing something that no one watching him that day could possibly have predicted would matter to the future of an empire at all. To understand the man in this tent, we must first meet the boy who never wanted the purple. Chapter 2. A boy among the colonnades asterisk. Picture a courtyard at dawn, the marble still cool from the night, dew collecting in the grooves of a stone bench that no one has bothered to cushion. A boy of perhaps 7 crosses this space barefoot, deliberately, because his household has decided that shoes are for outdoors and softness is a habit to be resisted rather than indulged. This is the Caelian Hill, one of Rome's more dignified residential districts, and the villa belongs to a senatorial family with old money, older lineage, and a peculiar suspicion of comfort. The boy's name at this point in his life is Marcus Annius Verus, and nothing about the scene suggests that he will one day be called anything else, let alone Emperor of Rome. He was born on the 26th of April in the year 121, in a house that stood not far from where the Colosseum's shadow fell each afternoon, though the boy himself would have had little reason to think of that monument as anything but scenery. Rome, in the year of his birth, was near the height of its territorial reach under Hadrian, an empire so vast that a courier riding hard could spend weeks simply crossing from one frontier to another. But an infant on the Caelian Hill knows nothing of frontiers. He knows the smell of lamp oil, the particular hush of a household run by slaves trained to move silently, and the shifting patterns of sunlight across a peristyle garden lined with clipped box hedges and small household shrines to ancestors he will never meet. The Anii Veri were not, strictly speaking, part of the innermost circle of imperial power. They were what Roman society might have called comfortably distinguished, wealthy enough to maintain a house with a proper library, a proper set of baths, a walled garden with fountains that ran on schedules rather than whims, but several careful degrees removed from the lethal proximity of the throne itself. This distance mattered. Imperial closeness in this period was less a privilege than a hazard, a fact that generations of Roman aristocrats had learned through the deaths of relatives who stood too near an emperor's paranoia or a rival's ambition. The Anii Veri had wealth without that particular danger, and it is worth pausing on this, because it means that nothing about young Marcus's earliest years was designed, consciously, to produce an emperor. Whatever discipline was instilled in him was instilled for its own sake, as a matter of family virtue, not political preparation. And the discipline, by every surviving account, was considerable. Consider the courtyard again, that same stretch of shaded colonnade where a Roman senatorial child might reasonably expect to spend his mornings at leisure, perhaps supervised by a nursemaid, perhaps permitted the small luxuries appropriate to his class. Instead, this particular courtyard functioned as something closer to a training ground. Here the boy exercised in the Roman fashion, running short sprints across the tiled floor, wrestling with other boys of similar rank under the half-watchful eye of a household tutor, practicing the kind of physical endurance that a later Rome would associate with soldiers rather than senators' grandsons. Cold baths were not a punishment in this household. They were policy. Warm water, it was believed by the elder generation raising him, softened not only the skin but the will beneath it, and so the boy bathed cold, dressed simply, and ate food that a wealthier or lazier family might have considered beneath their station. Plain bread, vegetables, little meat, nothing that could be mistaken for indulgence. His mother, Domitia Lucilla, was among the wealthier women in Rome, the heir to a fortune built partly on brick and tile manufacturing, an unglamorous industry that nonetheless made her one of the most financially secure widows in the city. She could have raised her son surrounded by every luxury Roman wealth could purchase. Silk, perfume, a retinue of attendants trained to anticipate his every want before he had finished forming the thought. Instead, visitors to the household described a boy who was, if anything, more austere than his circumstances required. There is a detail preserved from his childhood, almost too vivid to be forgotten once heard. That young Marcus, given a soft bed appropriate to his station, chose instead to sleep on the bare floor beside it, wrapped in a rough skin, because he had decided, at an age when most children think of little beyond play, that comfort made the mind weak. His mother would find him there in the mornings, and the detail survives precisely because it startled the household enough to be remembered and repeated. Why would a child do this? We should resist the urge to romanticize it too quickly, to turn a small boy's floor sleeping into some precocious philosophical statement, because at 7 or 8, there is likely more instinct than doctrine behind such choices, more imitation of admired adults than fully formed conviction. But the instinct itself matters. Somewhere in this household, discipline was being modeled as a virtue worth imitating, and the boy was watching closely enough and taking it seriously enough to apply it to his own small body before anyone had asked him to. The household shrines scattered through the villa, small niches holding images of ancestors and household gods, the lares and penates that every Roman family maintained with quiet, daily ritual, gave the boy his first sense of duty as something owed rather than chosen. Each morning, offerings were made. Each evening, the household gathered briefly before these modest altars, tucked into corners of the peristyle, illuminated by small oil lamps whose flicker the boy would have known intimately. Long before another lamp, decades later and 1,000 miles north, would illuminate a very different kind of devotion. Then, when Marcus was still very young, likely no older than 3, his father died. Marcus Annius Verus the elder is barely a presence in the surviving record, a name attached to a death rather than a life, and this absence is itself worth noting because it shapes everything that follows. There is no dramatic deathbed scene preserved for us, no final words exchanged between father and son. There is simply a household that at some point contained a father and then did not. A study that once held his belongings, gradually emptied or repurposed. A place at the table that quietly closed up around its absence, the way households do, the way grief settles into furniture rearrangement rather than declaration. What we do know is what came after. Guardianship passed to the boy's paternal grandfather, also named Marcus Annius Verus, a man who had served as consul 3 times, whose reputation rested not on flamboyance or spectacle, but on the old, unfashionable virtues of the vanishing republic. Restraint, duty, a suspicion of glory for its own sake. It was to this grandfather's house and this grandfather's temperament that the boy was largely entrusted, and the arrangement suited him. The elder Verus was not a warm figure in any performative sense, not a man given to public displays of affection, but his household ran on a moral seriousness that the boy absorbed the way other children absorbed the games of the street. It was in this grandfather's library, more than anywhere else in Rome, that young Marcus revealed the strangeness that would define him. While other aristocratic boys staged mock naval battles in garden pools or play-acted as gladiators with wooden swords, servants indulging their fantasies of conquest, Marcus could reliably be found seated on the cool marble floor beside a scroll rack, working through the dense Latin of Cato the Elder or attempting, with visible effort, to parse the Greek of Plato, his small finger tracing beneath each word, as though the physical contact might help the meaning settle into him. He kept, even at this early age, something resembling a private journal, a habit of recording not merely what happened to him, but what he thought about what happened. One surviving fragment of this instinct, reconstructed from later accounts of his character, captures the pattern precisely. A note to himself asking why he had been angry at his tutor for correcting a mistake, followed by his own quiet correction of the thought. Was correction not, after all, a kind of gift? This was not typical behavior for a Roman child of 7 or 8. It was not even typical behavior for a Roman adult. And it is precisely this quality, this early habit of turning inward to examine his own reactions rather than simply acting on them, that would eventually catch the attention of the most powerful man in the world. But that attention was still to come. For now, the boy's Rome remained small and contained. The villa, the library, the shaded courtyard, the household shrines, the cold baths, the plain meals eaten without complaint, because complaint had simply never been modeled for him as an option. If he thought about the wider city at all, it was likely as most children think about the adult world beyond their household walls, as something glimpsed rather than inhabited. The Forum Romanum, that great stone theatre of Roman public life, where senators debated and crowds gathered, and the machinery of empire performed itself daily in marble and bronze, would have been visible to him only from a distance. Perhaps on the rare occasions his grandfather took him down from the Caelian hill into the city's ceremonial heart. He would have seen the columns, the crowds, the officials moving through their choreographed rituals of power, and understood, in whatever dim way a child understands such things, that this was a world he did not yet belong to. And somewhere beyond even the Forum, rising on the Palatine Hill in a way that no resident of Rome could entirely ignore, sat the imperial palace itself. Sprawling, marble-clad, ringed with a silence that spoke of power rather than peace, home to an emperor whose gaze, it was said, could elevate a family's fortunes with a single word of favor, or ruin them just as easily with a single word of suspicion. From the Caelian Hill, on a clear day, its rooftops would have been visible above the city's clutter, a permanent fixture on the boy's horizon that meant, as yet, nothing personal to him at all. That would not remain true for very much longer, because somewhere inside that palace, an aging emperor named Hadrian, a man famous throughout the empire for his restless intelligence and his taste for Greek philosophy and architecture in equal measure, was beginning to take an interest in the households of Rome's senatorial class, quietly assessing the character of the young men who might, one day, need to be trusted with more than any of them yet realized. And in a city full of ambitious fathers eager to place their sons in front of exactly this kind of imperial attention, it would be the quiet, floor-sleeping, Greek-reading grandson of a 3-time consul, a boy who had never once sought the palace's notice, who would eventually draw Hadrian's eye entirely by accident, during a public ceremony that the boy very nearly ruined through an act of scrupulous honesty no one had asked of him. Chapter 3. The palace takes notice. Picture the Villa Adriana at Tivoli on a summer afternoon, a sprawling complex of pools, colonnades, and libraries that the Emperor Hadrian built as a kind of private universe, a Rome within Rome, filled with reproductions of monuments he had admired on his travels through Egypt and Greece. Cypress trees cast long shadows across water that never quite stops moving, channeled through canals designed to evoke the Nile. Frescoed corridors stretch between chambers so numerous that a visitor could lose an afternoon simply walking their length. It is a place built by a man who had once ruled the known world and now, in his final years, wished mostly to be left alone with his books, his architecture, and his failing body. By the year 138, Hadrian was dying. The precise nature of his illness remains debated by history, but its effects were not. Swelling, breathlessness, a mind increasingly consumed by the urgent, unglamorous business of succession. He had ruled for 2 decades, had walked the length of his empire inspecting its frontiers with his own eyes rather than trusting reports, and now faced the one problem that all that power could not solve. He had no son, and an empire without a settled heir was, in the memory of every Roman who had lived through the chaos of civil war, an empire inviting catastrophe. His first choice of heir, a young senator named Cneius Commodus, had already died before he could take the throne. Hadrian needed someone new, and he needed a plan sturdy enough to survive his own death by years, not months. What he settled on was not simply an heir, but an architecture of succession, a structure built to outlast a single lifetime. His eyes fell on Antoninus, a senator in his early 50s, respected, wealthy, notably without sons of his own to complicate the arrangement. But Hadrian's plan carried a condition, and it is this condition that pulls our boy from the Caelian hill directly into the machinery of the state. Antoninus would be adopted as Hadrian's son and heir, yes. But Antoninus, in turn, would be required to adopt two young men of his own, Lucius Verus, son of Hadrian's first failed heir, and Marcus Annius Verus, the same boy who had once slept on his bedroom floor to toughen his will. Why this boy? The historical record offers us a moment worth lingering on, because it is the closest thing we have to an explanation. Some years earlier, at a public religious ceremony in the Roman Forum, young Marcus had been serving in a ceremonial role appropriate to a boy of his rank, carrying a sacred tablet in a procession. He dropped it. This alone would have meant little. Such accidents were common enough among nervous children thrust into adult ritual. What made the moment memorable was what happened next. Rather than allow the mistake to pass quietly, as the attending priests seemed willing to do, the boy stopped the procession himself and announced his error aloud, insisting on performing the proper penance despite the laughter rippling through the assembled crowd. Watching from his seat, Hadrian reportedly leaned forward, asking who this strange, scrupulously honest child was. Told that he was the grandson of a three-time consul, the emperor filed the name away. It was not forgotten. Hadrian began inviting the boy to imperial gatherings, and what he found there only deepened his fascination. In a court built entirely on calculated flattery, where every compliment concealed a transaction and every smile had a price, here was a child seemingly incapable of the game. At one banquet, testing his courtiers with a philosophical riddle, Hadrian asked young Marcus whether he would rather be wealthy or wise. Without hesitation, the boy answered that he would choose wisdom, since wealth could be lost in a single day, but what a person truly understood could never be taken from him. When the emperor, amused, pressed further and asked what exactly the boy understood, Marcus answered that he understood very little, which was precisely why he read so much. It was this quality that earned him the nickname Hadrian would use from then on, Verisimus, the most truthful one, not a term of casual affection, but a recognition, from a man surrounded daily by practiced deception, of something genuinely rare. And so, in the year 138, this quality became state policy. Marcus, 17 years old, was folded into the adoption scheme not because he had campaigned for the honor, not because his family had maneuvered for it in the manner so common among Rome's ambitious houses, but because an old, dying emperor had once. Watched a boy insist on his own honesty in front of a laughing crowd, and had never quite let go of the memory. The rituals that followed were not private matters. They were public theater, staged with the full ceremonial weight the Roman state could muster. Marcus underwent his toga virilis, the formal ceremony marking a boy's transition into manhood, somewhat earlier than custom typically allowed, an acceleration that itself signaled how urgently Hadrian wished to settle the succession before his own death. Augural ceremonies followed, priests reading omens in the flight of birds and the entrails of sacrificed animals, formally consecrating what was, underneath the religious language, a political transaction of the highest order. Marble courtyards that had once been simply backdrops to Marcus's boyhood visits now became the settings for negotiations conducted in the careful, coded language of Roman aristocracy, where every gesture carried implications of power, obligation, and risk. We should pause here and ask the question this chapter has been circling from its first sentence. Why did this boy, a boy who had shown every sign of preferring a quiet library to a public stage, accept any of this at all? The honest answer is that acceptance was never really presented to him as a choice. Roman adoption was not a sentimental family matter. It was a binding legal instrument, and refusal was not a live option available to a 17-year-old whose grandfather had built a life on service to the state. But there is something more here than mere obligation. Later in his life, Marcus would write of his reluctance to assume power, of a genuine unease at the prospect of the throne, sentiments that ring false coming from most Roman aristocrats, but carry an unusual weight coming from a boy whose entire childhood had been built around suspicion of comfort and performance rather than pursuit of them. He did not want the purple. He accepted it anyway, because duty, in the moral vocabulary his grandfather had instilled in him since infancy, was not something one evaluated for personal benefit. It was simply owed. The physical relocation that followed was its own kind of transformation. Marcus moved from his grandfather's villa on the Caelian hill, with its shaded gardens and modest library and cold baths, into the house of Tiberius, the imperial residence complex on the Palatine that had loomed over his childhood horizon as a distant, unreachable silhouette. Now its corridors were his to walk, its frescoed antechambers, watched constantly by slaves, freedmen, and the ever-present eyes of a court that had learned to read power in the smallest gestures, became the daily environment of a boy who had once preferred a house, in his own words, with fewer people watching him think. The gardens at Tivoli, with their imitation Nile and their endless colonnades, and the marble halls of the Palatine Palace in Rome, were now the twin poles of his existence, each a monument to a power he had not sought and could no longer avoid. Hadrian died the following year, in 138, having lived just long enough to see his succession architecture set irreversibly in motion. Antoninus took the throne, becoming Antoninus Pius, and honored his adoptive father's condition without hesitation, formally adopting both Lucius Verus and Marcus as his own sons and heirs. Despite this staggering elevation, despite finding himself now, at 17, directly in line for the throne of the Roman world, Marcus made a private decision that would define the rest of his life. He would not allow this position to change who he fundamentally was. He continued his studies with the same discipline he had shown as a boy on his grandfather's library floor, even as further honors, titles, and ceremonial obligations accumulated around him like sediment. But an education built for an ordinary senator's grandson would no longer suffice. The boy who was now, unmistakably, an heir to the empire required something far more extraordinary. A curriculum designed not merely to inform his mind, but to forge his character into something capable of bearing the full weight of Roman power without being crushed or corrupted by it. 12 tutors would soon descend upon him, one by one, each bringing a different discipline, a different lesson disguised as instruction. It was here, in sunlit tutorial rooms and quiet debate chambers within the very palace that had once seemed so distant from his childhood home, that the philosopher within the future emperor would truly begin to take shape. Chapter 4. The Making of a Stoic Mind. Picture a study within the Palatine complex, high windows admitting the flat gold light of a Roman afternoon, dust motes drifting above a table crowded with wax tablets stacked in uneven towers. A young man, perhaps 18 now, sits with a stylus in hand, not writing at this moment but listening, because the man across from him has just asked a question that seems, on its surface, to have nothing to do with governance at all. This was the daily reality of Marcus's adolescence following his adoption. Not battlefield training, not lessons in statecraft delivered by generals, but a procession of tutors, 12 of them by most accounts, each arriving with a different discipline and a different way of testing the boy who would one day rule the known world. It is worth understanding this curriculum clearly, because it explains something that would otherwise remain mysterious: how a Roman heir became, of all things, a philosopher. The first tutor of real consequence was Diognetus, who taught Marcus painting. This seems, at first glance, a strange subject for a future emperor, until one considers how Diognetus taught it. He would grind pigment himself, sitting beside his student with mortar and pestle, demonstrating the physical labor behind color. Cinnabar, the brilliant red used in the finest Roman frescoes, was mined at extraordinary human cost in the mountains of Hispania, men dying slowly of mercury poisoning to produce a hue that, mixed with common clay, became nothing more than muddy brown. The emperor's purple and a slave's blood, Diognetus reportedly observed, came from remarkably similar sources when examined closely enough. Through pigment and brushwork, the tutor was teaching Marcus something far larger than technique: that power and poverty were often just different colors applied to the same human material, and that surfaces deceive. Then came Alexander of Kocium, ostensibly a teacher of Greek grammar, though his true curriculum ran deeper. He assigned Marcus the most punishing passages of Homer, insisting the young man translate not the easy heroic boasts, but the scenes of grief. Achilles weeping uncontrollably for his fallen companion Patroclus, the aged Trojan king Priam kneeling before his son's killer to beg for the boy's mangled body. "You will one day sign death warrants," Alexander told him plainly. "Remember that even your enemies are someone's beloved son." Marcus spent long nights parsing Greek syntax, not because the language itself was unfamiliar to educated Romans, but because Alexander believed that wrestling with foreign grammar trained the mind to approach familiar moral problems from unfamiliar angles. The most demanding instructor by far was Herod's Atticus, a Greek orator whose personal fortune rivaled the imperial treasury itself, a man famous throughout the empire for both his eloquence and his theatrical cruelty towards students. Herod's forced Marcus to deliver identical speeches dozens of times over, sometimes as many as 50 repetitions of a single oration, each time addressing an imagined audience of different character and temperament. Speak now, he would instruct, as though to hostile senators; now, as though to a crowd of grieving mothers; now, as though every listener already despises you. The exercise was exhausting, deliberately so, designed to strip away the natural theatrical instincts of rhetoric and replace them with something steadier: the ability to speak truth regardless of the audience's mood, a skill that would matter enormously to a man who would one day address legions on the edge of death. Alongside rhetoric came law, taught with grinding precision by tutors whose names survive less vividly than their method. Marcus was drilled in the technicalities of Roman civil and property law, the tangled inheritance disputes and contractual obligations that formed the unglamorous machinery beneath the empire's marble surface. This was not education for its own sake. It was preparation for the thousands of judicial appeals that would one day cross an emperor's desk: disputes between provincial merchants, inheritance quarrels among Italian farmers, matters that never appeared in triumphal art but consumed enormous portions of an emperor's actual working life. Picture the courtyards where these lessons often took place, open to the sky, tiled in patterns of white and grey stone, echoing faintly with the sound of a young man's voice, repeating the same argument for the 40th time while a tutor paced nearby, arms folded, listening for the smallest lapse into insincerity. This was not decoration. This was training, as rigorous and repetitive as any soldier's drill, except the weapon being forged here was character rather than sword arm. But of all the tutors who shaped Marcus during these years, one would matter more than all the others combined, and his arrival marks the true turning point of this entire chapter of the young man's life. Quintus Junius Rusticus was not like the wealthy, celebrated Herod's Atticus, nor did he share Alexander's academic polish. Rusticus dressed plainly, in the manner of a man who had deliberately chosen simplicity over the display his rank might otherwise have permitted him. His personal library, modest by the standards of Rome's aristocratic collectors, contained not ornamental scrolls, meant to impress visitors but working texts, heavily annotated, clearly read and reread rather than merely displayed. It was Rusticus who introduced Marcus formally to Stoic philosophy, and crucially, he did not teach it as abstract theory to be memorized and recited for effect. He taught it as something to be lived daily, in small and unglamorous ways. Picture the room where these lessons occurred. Sparse, functional, lit by ordinary oil lamps rather than the elaborate fixtures found elsewhere in the palace. Rusticus reportedly lent Marcus his own private copy of Epictetus's Discourses, a philosopher who had himself been born a slave before becoming one of Rome's most respected Stoic teachers, a fact Rusticus made certain his aristocratic student understood clearly. Wisdom, the lesson implied, cared nothing for the accident of birth. A slave could possess it. An emperor could lack it entirely. It was under Rusticus's influence that Marcus began, for the first time in a documented, sustained way, the private habit that would define the rest of his life. Writing notes to himself, not for publication, not for any audience beyond his own conscience, examining his daily failures and small victories with the same rigorous honesty that had once made him stop a religious procession as a child to admit a dropped tablet. This was the seed, planted quietly in a modest study within a palace built for spectacle, of what would one day become his private notebooks. Consider the significance of this quietly, because the documentary must return to it again before the story ends. Decades from this study, in a frozen tent beside the Danube, an aging emperor would sit hunched over a wax tablet, writing sentences that historians would eventually gather under the title Meditations. The habit did not begin in that tent. It began here, in this unremarkable room, under the patient instruction of a plainly dressed philosopher who believed that virtue was not decoration for a life already secured by wealth and rank, but the daily, unglamorous discipline of examining one's own thoughts with unflinching honesty. Rusticus taught him to distinguish between what a person could control and what they could not, the very foundation of Stoic thought. Reputation, wealth, the opinions of others, even one's own body and its health, these lay largely outside a person's control. But judgment, response, the capacity to choose virtue over vice in any given moment, these remained entirely within reach regardless of external circumstance. It was a philosophy built for exactly the kind of crisis Marcus could not yet imagine he would one day face. Plague, war, betrayal, the slow erosion of an empire under pressures no single man could fully control. The stylus and tablet became, during these years, more than instruments of education. They became instruments of self-examination, carried forward from this palace study into every later chapter of his life. When war eventually came, when disease swept through his legions, when the burden of ruling the known world pressed down upon him with a weight his childhood on the Caelian hill could never have prepared him for, it would be this exact discipline, learned first in Rusticus's plain, unadorned study, that Marcus would return to again and again. He did not yet know, sitting in that sunlit tutorial room with wax tablets stacked before him, that he was rehearsing for a war camp on a frozen river he had never seen, that the notebook habit forming now under a patient teacher's quiet guidance would one day become his only true refuge from plague fires and barbarian drums. But the foundation was being laid, deliberately and carefully, lesson by lesson, tutor by tutor, until the boy who had once slept on his bedroom floor to strengthen his will had become something considerably rarer. A Roman heir being shaped, quite deliberately, into a philosopher first and an emperor only by necessity. That transformation was not yet complete. The purple still waited, and with it, burdens this sunlit courtyard could not yet imagine. Asterisk chapter 5. The Purple and the Burden. Picture a deathbed in the imperial villa at Lorium, some miles outside Rome, in March of the year 161. An old man lies beneath fine linens, his breathing shallow, his mind already drifting toward the borders of delirium. Antoninus Pius has ruled for 23 years with a steadiness so complete that later historians would struggle to find anything dramatic to say about his reign at all. And this, for a Roman emperor, was itself a kind of miracle. Now, dying of what appears to have been a sudden fever, he offers his final instructions to the watch officer standing near the door. The password for the night, drawn from the Stoic vocabulary his adopted son had spent decades absorbing, is a single word: equanimity. Then he asks that the golden statue of Fortune kept in his private chamber, the one traditionally transferred to each new emperor upon his predecessor's death, be carried immediately to the bedroom of Marcus Aurelius. The gesture requires no further explanation. It is a passing of the torch made in silence, wordless and absolute. Consider what this moment meant for the man receiving that statue. Marcus Aurelius was 40 years old, no longer the truthful boy who had once startled Hadrian in the Forum, no longer even the diligent student who had filled Rusticus's study with careful translations of Epictetus. He was, by every external measure, ready. He had spent over 2 decades as Antoninus's understudy, absorbing the administrative rhythms of empire, sitting beside the older man during audiences, learning to read petitions and weigh judicial appeals with the same rigor his tutors had once demanded of his rhetoric. And yet, when the moment finally arrived, when the Senate moved with predictable speed to confirm him as sole emperor, Marcus did something almost unprecedented in the history of Roman succession. He refused to rule alone. The Senate had offered him the throne outright, expecting the customary gratitude. The ceremonial modesty followed swiftly by acceptance. Instead, Marcus insisted that Lucius Verus, his adopted brother, be elevated as co-emperor, granted equal tribunician power and the title of Augustus alongside his own. No emperor before him had voluntarily divided supreme authority in quite this manner. Some later commentators would suggest this was a debt of honor, a fulfillment of the obligation Hadrian's original adoption scheme had implied decades earlier. Others would suggest something more personal, that Marcus, who had never particularly wanted the crushing weight of sole rule, understood instinctively that a burden divided was a burden made survivable. Whatever the precise mixture of motive, the Senate agreed, and Rome found itself, for the first time in its history, governed by 2 emperors simultaneously. Picture now the ceremony that followed, staged with all the theatrical weight the Roman state could summon. The Forum Romanum, that stone amphitheater of public power, glimpsed from a distance throughout Marcus's boyhood, now became the setting for his own accession. He wore the toga picta, the deep Tyrian purple robe reserved exclusively for triumphant generals and emperors, its dye extracted at brutal cost from thousands of crushed murex sea snails, a fabric so expensive that its color alone announced the wearer's separation from ordinary humanity. Gold leaf caught the sunlight on ceremonial standards. Marble and ivory surfaces, polished for the occasion, reflected a spectacle designed to overwhelm the senses and silence doubt. And yet we should pause here, because the documentary must insist on this juxtaposition even as the crowds cheered. The man wearing that purple had written, years earlier, and would continue to write, a private warning to himself. See that you do not turn into a Caesar, he cautioned in his own notebooks. Do not be dipped into the purple dye, for that can happen. It is a strange, almost paradoxical sentence to find in the private papers of a reigning emperor, an explicit fear of the very transformation the ceremony in the Forum was designed to celebrate. While gold and purple announced his elevation above ordinary men, Marcus retreated, whenever the ceremonial obligations permitted, to a modest private study within the palace, continuing the exact discipline Rusticus had instilled in him years before. Plain dress when no audience required otherwise, careful examination of his own conduct, the wax tablet always within reach. This was the defining tension of his early reign, spectacle on one side, austerity on the other, and it would only intensify as the demands of empire multiplied. Because within months of his accession, trouble arrived from the east. The Parthian Empire, Rome's ancient and formidable rival across the Euphrates, had watched the transition of power in Rome with the calculating patience of an old enemy. Vologases IV, king of Parthia, judged this moment of uncertain dual leadership to be exactly the opportunity he had waited for. Parthian forces crossed into Roman territory, crushing a legion in Armenia and installing a puppet ruler in the client kingdom Rome had long protected. The governor of Syria fled. It was, by any measure, a direct and humiliating challenge to Roman authority, arriving less than a year into the new reign. Picture the dusty frontier camps of the Roman East that now filled the horizon of imperial concern, a landscape utterly unlike the marble halls of the Palatine. Sun-baked mud-brick fortifications, dry riverbeds, siege lines drawn against cities whose names, Nisibis and later the great metropolis of Seleucia and its sister city Ctesiphon, had echoed through Roman military history for generations. It was to this theatre that Lucius Verus was dispatched, nominally in command, accompanied by the empire's most experienced generals, including Gaius Avidius Cassius, a hard, capable officer who would prove instrumental to whatever success followed. Marcus himself remained in Rome, a decision that reflected both practical necessity and his own temperament. He was, by inclination and training, an administrator and a judge rather than a battlefield commander, and the empire's daily machinery, tax disputes, judicial appeals, grain distribution, could not simply pause while its rulers campaigned abroad. The Parthian War dragged on from 161 to 166, its campaigns unfolding across a landscape the documentary must render honestly. Not the clean triumphal narratives later carved into commemorative columns, but the grinding reality of desert sieges, supply lines stretched dangerously thin, disease already beginning to test Roman ranks even before the greater catastrophe arrived. Roman forces eventually achieved a significant victory, sacking the Parthian capital region and restoring a client king favorable to Roman interests. Lucius Verus, whatever his personal shortcomings, which later historians would catalogue at considerable length, oversaw a campaign that concluded in genuine Roman success. And so, in 166, the legions began their long march home, and Rome prepared to celebrate. Picture the triumphal procession that followed, winding through streets thick with cheering crowds, wagons loaded with captured treasure, soldiers marching in formation beneath standards that had, in the Eastern campaigns, tasted genuine victory. Marcus and Lucius rode together, sharing the honor as they had shared the throne, the purple and gold of imperial ceremony once again on full display against Rome's white marble backdrop. It should have been, by every measure available to the participants themselves, an unambiguous triumph. But look more closely at the baggage trains rolling in behind the triumphant columns. Look at the crates of Eastern plunder, the sacks of grain requisitioned from conquered territory, the exhausted pack animals, and the soldiers themselves, weathered by years of campaigning in unfamiliar climates. Something had traveled with them from the east, something no triumphal arch would ever commemorate, something invisible to every eye watching the procession pass. The returning army carried a passenger no census had counted and no general had planned for, moving quietly among the crates and the veterans and the captured treasure, waiting to disembark into the crowded, unsuspecting heart of the Roman world. Chapter 6. The Invisible Enemy. Picture the port district of Ostia in the late summer of the year 166. The warehouses along the Tiber's mouth, crowded as always with amphorae of oil, sacks of grain, crates stamped with the marks of eastern provinces. Dockworkers move among the returning military cargo with the practiced indifference of men who have unloaded 1,000 such shipments before. Nothing about this particular delivery looks different from any other. No one thinks to question why so many porters, within days of handling these crates, begin complaining of fever. Within weeks, the complaints have stopped being isolated. Within months, they have stopped being complaints at all, and have become something closer to a citywide emergency, though no one in Rome yet possesses the vocabulary to describe what is happening to them. This is the beginning of the Antonine Plague, and it is worth pausing to consider just how little the ancient world understood about what was unfolding in its streets. There was no concept of a virus, no microscope, no germ theory of disease. What Romans possessed instead was observation, accumulated over centuries, and a physician in Rome named Galen of Pergamon, who would spend the coming years documenting, with clinical precision, a catastrophe he was almost entirely powerless to stop. Galen's writings survive as some of the most valuable evidence historians possess for what this disease actually did to the human body, and they deserve to be read not as literary flourish, but as a physician's honest, methodical record of helplessness. He described a fever that arrived suddenly and burned hot enough to derange the mind. He described, several days into the illness, an eruption across the skin, first small red marks, then pustules that darkened and hardened, covering the body in a manner some later scholars would compare to scales. He noted a foul odor that seemed to precede death in the worst cases, and diarrhea so severe and prolonged that it alone proved fatal in a significant portion of patients. Modern researchers, examining Galen's descriptions alongside other surviving accounts, now believe the disease was most likely smallpox, though some have argued for measles or a related pathogen. Whatever its precise identity, its effects were unmistakable and unmistakably catastrophic. Consider what it would have meant to live through this in a city like Rome, a metropolis housing, by some estimates, close to 1 million. People crowded into insulae, multi-story apartment blocks with poor ventilation and minimal sanitation, where disease could move between neighbors separated by nothing more than a thin plaster wall. Picture the markets of the Subura district, ordinarily a chaotic tangle of shouting vendors and packed foot traffic, falling gradually silent as stallholders either fled the city or simply stopped opening their shutters. Picture the wooden slats pulled across shopfronts throughout the Forum Boarium, the cattle market, once loud with commerce, now eerily still except for the occasional cart creaking past, loaded with something other than produce. The dead accumulated faster than the city's ordinary rituals of burial could process them. Rome had strict laws, dating back centuries, against burial within the city walls, a practice rooted in both religious sensibility and basic sanitation. Under ordinary circumstances, funeral processions moved out along roads like the Via Appia to tombs and columbaria lining the highways beyond the walls. But these were not ordinary circumstances. The volume of dead overwhelmed every existing mechanism for handling them. Ancient sources describe cartloads of corpses moving through the city, a grim inversion of the grain wagons that had once fed it, and mass funeral pyres burning continuously at the city's edges, their smoke visible for miles, a persistent grey smear against the sky that Romans could see from the hills surrounding their own capital. Ash from these pyres settled everywhere. It settled on the white marble of temple porticos. It settled on the polished steps of the Senate House. It settled, presumably, on the gleaming corridors of the Palatine Palace itself, that same complex of frescoed halls and watchful antechambers that had once seemed, to a young Marcus arriving from his grandfather's modest villa, the very image of untouchable imperial permanence. Now those same corridors stood eerily hushed, their usual traffic of petitioners, clerks and courtiers, thinned by fear, illness and death in roughly equal measure. Picture the emperor's own household staff, servants who had spent years anticipating his needs before he voiced them, disappearing one by one, some fleeing the city as Galen himself reportedly did, retreating from Rome to his home region rather than remain in a capital that seemed, quite literally, to be dying around him. This detail deserves particular attention because it tells us something important about the limits of even the era's greatest medical mind. Galen was, by the standards of his age, an extraordinarily accomplished physician, a man whose anatomical and physiological theories would shape Western medicine for well over a millennium after his death. And confronted with this disease, his honest response, at least initially, was retreat. There was no treatment he could offer that meaningfully altered the course of the illness. His genuine contribution was observation, not cure, and it is a measure of the disease's severity that even Rome's most celebrated medical authority chose flight over false reassurance. Consider what happened to the makeshift hospitals that Roman authorities scrambled to establish as the crisis deepened. These were not hospitals in any modern sense, but repurposed public buildings, temple porticos, sometimes simply open courtyards where the sick were laid out in rows, because there was nowhere else to put them and no meaningful treatment to offer beyond water, shade, and whatever herbal remedies desperate families still believed might help. The historian Dio Cassius, writing later, would describe deaths in Rome at the height of the outbreak reaching staggering daily totals, numbers that, even allowing for ancient tendencies toward exaggeration, convey a scale of mortality that modern readers can scarcely comprehend. Across the wider empire, estimates for total plague deaths run as high as 5 million people, a figure that, if accurate, would represent one of the deadliest pandemics in the ancient world prior to the far more famous plague of Justinian centuries later. Picture the household shrines throughout the city, the same small niches holding images of ancestral spirits and protective gods that had structured Marcus's own childhood devotions on the Caelian hill decades earlier. In ordinary times, these shrines received modest daily offerings, a few grains of incense, a small libation of wine. Now they were overwhelmed, buried under desperate accumulations of offerings from families begging any available deity for intervention. Temples throughout Rome reported similar surges, worshippers arriving with sacrifices, incense, entire fortunes in some cases, seeking divine explanation and divine mercy for a catastrophe that offered neither. Marcus Aurelius, we should note, did not respond to this crisis with the fatalism that characterized so much of the popular religious response around him. Imperial policy under his direction included measures that, while primitive by modern epidemiological standards, at least demonstrate an attempt at practical governance rather than pure resignation. Funeral regulations were relaxed to allow faster and more efficient disposal of the dead. There is evidence that the state assisted with burial costs for citizens who could not otherwise afford proper rites, an acknowledgement that ordinary civic mechanisms had simply been overwhelmed. Grain distributions continued, though strained, as the disease disrupted agricultural labor and trade routes throughout Italy. None of it constituted a cure. None of it could have. But it reflects the same instinct that had defined Marcus since childhood, a preference for disciplined, practical duty over despair, even when duty could accomplish only incremental good against an overwhelming catastrophe. And here we must return to the open question this documentary has been building toward since the very first images of ash, drifting over a frozen frontier camp. What did this plague cost Marcus personally, And how did that cost shape the private writing he had begun years earlier under Rusticus's quiet instruction? The evidence here is fragmentary, as it so often is with ancient private grief, but it is suggestive. Lucius Verus, Marcus's co-emperor and adopted brother, the man who had shared his throne and his triumphal procession through Rome's streets, died in the year 169, while traveling with Marcus toward the northern frontier. The precise cause of his death remains debated among historians. Some ancient sources suggest a stroke, others point toward food poisoning, but a considerable body of modern scholarship considers plague among the most plausible explanations, given the timing and the disease's already established presence throughout the empire and its armies. If this is correct, then Marcus lost his co-ruler, his adopted brother, a man he had known since childhood adoption schemes first bound their fates together under Hadrian's dying design, to the very disease now consuming his empire. Picture Marcus receiving this news, wherever he received it, whatever room or tent or roadside camp contained him in that moment. The documentary must resist inventing dialogue or interior monologue that the sources do not support. But we can observe, factually, what followed. Marcus did not withdraw from public duty. He organized Lucius's funeral, arranged for his deification by the Senate, the formal ritual recognition that transformed a dead emperor into a god, and continued, within days, addressing the administrative and military demands that had not paused to accommodate his grief. This pattern, duty continuing unbroken even through personal loss, would recur throughout the remainder of his life, and it is difficult not to see in it the direct fruit of Rusticus's old instruction. That grief, like every other reaction, was a matter of judgment, and judgment remained within a person's control even when circumstance did not. It is worth asking, too, what role the plague may have played in the losses within Marcus's own household, among the children born to him and his wife Faustina. Roman infant and child mortality was brutally high under even ordinary circumstances, and the historical record shows that several of Marcus's children died young across the span of his marriage, though attributing specific deaths to the plague with certainty exceeds what the sources reliably support. What can be said with confidence is this: Marcus lived through a period of concentrated, compounding loss, brother, subjects by the millions, and very possibly members of his own household, all while continuing to govern an empire that showed no inclination to pause its demands out of sympathy for his private sorrow. This is likely, more than any other single circumstance, the true crucible in which his private notebook practice deepened from an adolescent habit into something closer to a survival mechanism. The wax tablets that had once recorded a student's careful translations of Epictetus under Rusticus's patient supervision became, during these plague years and the frontier campaigns that followed, something else entirely. A private space where an emperor who could show no weakness in public could nonetheless interrogate his own mortality, his own fear, his own exhaustion, without an audience, without performance, without the purple robe that public duty required him to wear. Consider one more image before this chapter closes. Picture the eerie quiet that had settled by the early 170s over stretches of the Roman countryside itself, not merely the city. Entire agricultural communities in parts of Italy and the provinces had lost enough of their working population to disease that fields went unplanted. Granaries stood emptier than usual, and the ordinary rhythms of Roman rural life, so stable for generations, faltered visibly. This mattered enormously for what came next, because an empire weakened by plague, its treasury strained, its legions thinned by disease as much as by battle, was an empire increasingly vulnerable at precisely the frontiers where its enemies were watching most closely. And the plague did not remain confined to Rome and Italy. It moved, as diseases do, along the same roads and rivers that carried Roman soldiers, merchants, and administrators throughout the empire. It followed the legions north, into the provinces bordering the Rhine and Danube, into the very frontier zones where Marcus would soon be required to lead armies in person against tribal confederations, who had, for generations, studied Roman weakness with patient, calculating attention. The invisible enemy that had emptied Rome's markets and filled its funeral pyres was now marching, unseen and uninvited, toward a river far to the north, where a very different kind of siege was already beginning to take shape. Chapter 7. Snow, Smoke, and the Marcomannic Wars. Picture the Danube frontier not as a single place, but as a wound stretching nearly 1,000 miles. A scar of forts, watchtowers, and fortified camps running along the river's southern bank from the Alps to the Black Sea. By the year 168, when Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus first marched north together to confront a crisis that had been building for years, this frontier had already begun to buckle under pressure the empire had not faced in generations. Consider what was actually happening beyond that river. The Marcomanni and the Quadi Germanic peoples who had lived for decades in an uneasy, transactional peace with Rome found themselves squeezed by movements further north and east, other tribes, other pressures, a slow demographic shove that historians still debate in its particulars, but whose consequence was unmistakable. Displaced peoples pressed against the frontier looking for land, for safety, for the wealth that Roman provinces represented. Behind them came the Iazyges, a Sarmatian people whose mounted warriors fought in a style the legions found genuinely difficult to counter, and further groups, the Lombardi and the Obii among others, testing the frontier's weakest points with increasing confidence. Picture the first breach, in 166 or 167, when 6,000 Lombardi and Obii warriors crossed into Roman Pannonia, an incursion large enough to require a full military response and small enough, in retrospect, to seem almost a probing exercise. Tribes testing whether the empire that had dominated this river for 2 centuries could still enforce its own borders. It could, that time. A negotiated peace followed, brokered partly through a king named Balamarius, and for a brief interval, Rome allowed itself the comfortable illusion that the frontier had merely hiccuped rather than begun to fail. That illusion did not survive long. Consider the catastrophe that struck in 170 at the Battle of Carnuntum, where a Roman force, its precise size debated, but its defeat undeniable, was annihilated by combined tribal armies. A disaster on a scale Rome had not suffered on this frontier in living memory. In its aftermath, the truly unthinkable occurred. Marcomannic and Quadi warbands did not merely raid the border provinces. They crossed the Alps entirely, pushing as far as northern Italy itself, laying siege to the city of Aquileia, a wealthy port near the head of the Adriatic. For the first time in nearly 3 centuries, foreign invaders stood on Italian soil. Picture what this meant to a Roman public accustomed to thinking of Italy as sacred, untouchable ground, insulated by distance and legions from the violence that had always, until now, remained comfortably elsewhere. It meant the frontier had not merely bent, it had broken. It was into this environment, this compounding catastrophe of plague-thinned legions and breached borders, that Marcus committed himself entirely. He would spend, from this point forward, most of the remaining years of his life not in Rome, but on campaign, personally commanding operations that emperors of the previous century might have delegated entirely to subordinate generals. Picture the camps themselves. And here we return to ground the documentary has already walked once, in the opening moments of this very story, but now with fuller understanding of everything that brought Marcus to this frozen riverbank. These camps followed the same disciplined grid the Roman military had used for centuries, streets laid out with geometric precision, a rectangle of imposed order stamped onto wilderness that acknowledged no such logic. Palisades of sharpened timber ringed the perimeter, Watchtowers stood at intervals, manned even through the worst winter nights, because the tribes across the river did not observe seasonal truces the way Roman commanders might have preferred. Beyond the palisades stretched forest and marsh, terrain the legions understood poorly and the Marcomanni and Quadi understood intimately. Landscape that favored ambush over the open field engagements at which Roman infantry excelled. And always, within this grid of Roman order, the twin fires burned. War dead, gathered after skirmishes and larger engagements, given what funeral rites the campaign's pace allowed. And plague dead, the Antonine plague having followed the legions north exactly as the previous chapter foretold, still killing soldiers who had survived Germanic spears only to choke, days later, on their own fluids in a frozen tent. Ancient sources describing this period speak of pestilence within the camps nearly as devastating as the fighting itself, and modern historians examining troop numbers across these years generally agree that disease, not battle, accounted for the majority of Roman losses on this frontier. It was here, amid exactly this landscape, that Marcus resumed and deepened the notebook practice first instilled by Rusticus decades earlier in a quiet, sunlit study utterly unlike this place. Picture the specific mechanics of it. A wax tablet, its surface a thin layer of beeswax poured over wood, capable of being smoothed and reused, practical for a man who could not carry libraries on campaign. A bronze or iron stylus, pointed at one end for writing, flattened at the other for erasing mistakes. An oil lamp, its flame small enough to conserve fuel that had to be transporting at considerable difficulty this far from any city, its light just sufficient for careful Greek characters formed by a hand that by these later years was not entirely steady. Consider what he likely wrote in conditions like these, based on what survives. Reflections on mortality appear throughout his private notebooks with a frequency that seems, given everything we now understand about his circumstances, entirely unsurprising. He wrote of how quickly all things fade into forgetfulness, how the longest-lived and the shortest-lived man come, in the end, to the same state. He wrote that it was not death a man should fear, but never beginning to live according to nature. Whether specific passages were composed on this specific riverbank in this specific winter cannot be proven with documentary certainty, and this account will not claim otherwise. But the thematic clustering is unmistakable. A man surrounded nightly by funeral pyres, commanding soldiers who might die of plague or spear with equal likelihood before dawn, does not write extensively about mortality by coincidence. He wrote also of duty, of the fleeting, hollow nature of glory, the very currency that had drawn triumphant crowds into Rome's streets after the Parthian campaign years earlier. Fame, he noted in thought scholars now place among these years, was the recollection of the dead, or the memory of the yet unborn who would forget him too. Whatever a man had built, however vast his conquests, time would erase it as thoroughly as it erased everything else. This was not despair. It was, within the Stoic framework Rusticus had first taught him, a kind of liberation. If glory could not be preserved, then a man was freed to focus entirely on the only thing that remained within his control, the quality of his own present action. Picture the drums again, the same ones that opened this entire story, carrying across black water on cold, clear nights when sound travels with unusual precision. Picture Roman sentries on the palisade listening to that rhythm and understanding it as a language of threat they could not translate but did not need to. Picture Marcus, inside his tent, hearing the same drums and choosing in that moment not strategy or fear but the stylus. This is not a small thing, and the documentary should not let it pass as one. Consider the sheer strangeness of a supreme military commander, facing enemies who by ancient accounts sometimes decapitated captured Romans and drank from their skulls in ritual displays meant to terrify. spending his private hours composing sentences about the proper way to greet the coming dawn, about how little external comfort a truly happy life required, about the discipline of accepting what could not be changed while still acting, without hesitation, on what could. The war itself ground on with grim, indecisive persistence. Roman forces under commanders, including Marcus's capable son-in-law, Claudius Pompeianus, achieved real victories, pushing back across the Danube, punishing the Marcomanni and Quadi campaigns intended to break their capacity for further incursion permanently. There were catastrophes too. The Iazyges killed a Roman governor during one especially difficult engagement. Roman forces, at various points, found themselves genuinely encircled, genuinely endangered, the outcome of individual campaigns far from guaranteed. Ancient accounts even preserve a story, likely embellished, but revealing of how contemporaries understood these events, of a so-called rain miracle, a sudden storm that reportedly saved a surrounded Roman legion from disaster, an event later Roman writers would attribute to divine favor. By the mid-170s, Marcus had pushed deep enough into tribal territory that Roman sources speak, with evident ambition, of plans to establish entirely new provinces north of the Danube, formal annexation of Marcomannic and Quadi lands that would have permanently redrawn the empire's northern boundary. Picture what this would have meant. A frontier finally secured, a threat permanently neutralized, a legacy to rival any conquering emperor Rome had ever produced. It never happened. Whether interrupted by renewed crisis elsewhere in the empire, by Marcus's own declining health, or simply by the sheer exhausting persistence of an enemy that refused to be permanently broken, the ambition dissolved into an ongoing, grinding stalemate. Years turned into a full decade of intermittent, unresolved warfare, campaign season, following campaign season, without the decisive victory that might have justified the enormous cost in lives, treasure, and the emperor's own diminishing strength. And here the chapter must end where it began, in uncertainty, because that is where Marcus himself stood. The frontier had not fallen. It had also not been secured. The plague continued its quiet, patient work among soldiers who had marched north believing the greatest danger waited across the river. The notebooks continued to fill, tablet by tablet, one private confession of doubt and discipline at a time, written by lamplight in a hand growing steadily older. Whether the frontier would finally hold, whether the empire's northern boundary would settle into lasting peace, or simply postpone its reckoning to some future generation, remained, even to Marcus himself in these final campaign years, genuinely unknown. What would become of the notebooks themselves, whether they would survive their author at all, was a question no one in that tent could have possibly answered. Chapter 8. The lamp outlives the empire. Picture Vindobona in the early spring of the year 180, a Roman fortress town on the Danube that history will later remember as Vienna. The snow has not fully lifted. The command tent stands where it has stood for months, canvas-patched, stakes driven deep into ground that thaws by day and freezes again each night. Inside, the lamp still burns, but the hand that once held the stylus with such steadiness now trembles, and the man attached to it has grown gaunt in a way that even his most loyal officers no longer bother to disguise from one another. Marcus Aurelius is 58 years old, and he is dying. The precise cause remains debated by historians even now, some pointing to the plague that had haunted his reign from its earliest years, others to a more general collapse brought on by decades of stress, campaign hardship, and a body that had simply reached its limit. What is not debated is the manner of it. There was no violence, no poison, no dramatic final battle. According to the accounts that survive, Marcus grew steadily weaker over several days, refusing food, aware with characteristic clarity of what was happening to him. He is said to have summoned his officers and his son, offered what final counsel he could, and then, quietly, stopped receiving visitors altogether. Witnesses described his final hours with a strange, almost eerie calm. His breathing grew shallower. His eyes, which had remained sharp and present through so many catastrophes, gradually lost their focus on the tent around him, as though he were looking at something beyond its canvas walls, beyond Vindobona, beyond the empire itself. His lips moved without sound. And then, with the same simplicity that had defined his entire philosophy, Marcus Aurelius stopped. There was no dramatic final breath, no death rattle for the historians to seize upon. He simply ceased, like a lamp running out of oil. Consider the closing of that image for a moment, because it is the same lamp that opened this entire story, and it will not burn very much longer. His son, Commodus, 19 years old and present at the frontier, though notably uninterested in the war itself, waited only long enough to be certain his father was truly gone before walking out to address the assembled legions. What followed happened with startling speed. Within an hour, ancient sources report, Commodus had promised the soldiers bonuses the imperial treasury could scarcely sustain. Within 3 hours, he had begun countermanding many of his father's final military orders, abandoning the ambitious plan to formally annex Marcomannic and Quadi territory north of the Danube, a plan Marcus had pursued at enormous cost for years. The philosopher-emperor's body was not yet cold before the careful architecture of his life's work began, quite literally, to come apart. Picture the contrast that followed across the next decade, because it is the payoff to everything this documentary has built toward. Where Marcus had spent years in frozen frontier tents, plainly dressed, writing private notes on discipline and duty, Commodus returned to Rome and embraced spectacle with an appetite his father had spent a lifetime resisting. He rebuilt his public image around the arena rather than the Senate House, reportedly appearing in the Colosseum himself, fighting as a gladiator against opponents whose defeat was arranged in advance. A display Roman aristocratic sensibility found genuinely scandalous. Where Marcus had governed through careful legal judgment and administrative patience, Commodus increasingly delegated power to favorites, and the disciplined machinery his father had maintained through plague and war began to slip, decade by decade, toward the instability that would eventually consume it. The austere frontier camp, with its wax tablets and modest lamp, gave way to a palace culture of excess that Marcus's own private writings had explicitly warned against. Do not be dipped into the purple dye he had cautioned himself years earlier. His son dove in completely. This is not the story of Commodus's reign, or of the long, complicated decline that Rome would experience across the centuries that followed. That is a story for another night. Tonight belongs to the lamp and to what happened to the words it illuminated, because here is the detail that makes this entire history worth telling at all. Marcus Aurelius never intended his private notebooks for anyone's eyes, but his own. There is no evidence he ever considered publication, no dedication naming a reader, no title beyond the simple Greek phrase meaning, roughly, things addressed to himself. These were not the writings of a man building a legacy. They were the writings of a man trying, in real time, to stay human while doing profoundly inhuman things. Watching soldiers die of plague, ordering armies into battle, governing an empire whose weight had never been something he sought. How the manuscript survived at all remains genuinely remarkable, and historians can only partially reconstruct the path. There is no clear record of what happened to these tablets and their transcribed copies in the years immediately following his death. They do not appear prominently in surviving records for centuries. Somewhere in that gap, through a process modern scholarship can trace only in fragments, private notebooks written in a war tent for an audience of exactly one were copied, likely by scribes who recognized their value even without official sanction. preserved through the collapse of the Western Empire, through the long, careful custodianship of Byzantine copyists who maintained Greek philosophical texts when so much else was lost. The work resurfaces clearly in the historical record only much later, eventually appearing in print in the 16th century under the title we know today, Meditations. Consider what this means. An empire that once stretched from Roman Britain to the Sahara, commanding 44 legions, is gone. Its roads are broken. Its administrative structures dissolved centuries ago. Commodus himself, whose reign undid so much of what his father built, is remembered now largely as a cautionary footnote. But the private thoughts of a sick, exhausted man scribbling by lamplight on a frozen riverbank, thoughts he never meant for us to read at all, have outlived every one of them. They have gone on to shape readers across 2 millennia, statesmen and soldiers, prisoners and presidents, anyone who has ever needed to be reminded that dignity is a discipline, not a circumstance. Bill Clinton has cited it. When Jiabao reportedly carried a copy, military commanders and hospice workers alike have found, in a text written by an emperor with no audience in mind, exactly the words they needed. Return, now, one final time, to that tent. The drums have long since fallen silent. The lamp has burned out. Ash settles quietly on a wax tablet where a hand once wrote, patiently, night after night, about virtue and duty and the proper way to face an uncertain dawn. The empire did not survive. The lamp did. And somewhere beyond that stilled tent, a much longer story waits, one of decline and spectacle and a son who could not carry his father's discipline. That story, the fall that followed this quiet ending, is one for another night.